Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum braucht er was zum Essen, bitte sehr. Es macht ihn ein Geschwätz nicht satt, das schafft kein Essen her.
Drum links, zwei, drei, drum links, zwei, drei, wo dein Platz genossen ist. Weil ich ein in die Arbeit einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum hat der Stiefel im Gesicht nicht gern. Er will unter sich keinen Sklaven sehen und über sich keinen Herrn.
Drum links, zwei, drei, drum links, zwei, drei, wo dein Platz genossen ist. Weil dich ein in die Arbeit einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Prolet ein Prolet ist, drum wird ihn kein anderer befreien. Es kann die Befreiung der Arbeiter nur das Werk der Arbeiter sein.
Drum links, zwei, drei, drum links, zwei, drei, und ein Platz genossen ist. Weil dich ein in die Arbeit einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Здравствуйте, comrades. It may not be Saturday, but we're doing socialism nonetheless. Welcome to Socialism Live, because it is the month of May and our favorite socialists over in Seattle are doing a whole series of presentations for us. How nice of them to do this. And I've been looking forward to Red May all year long. Now don't worry, Red May. I'm not going to stream every single one of your presentations because you guys do a lot of presentations. I'm not going to do this live for every single one of them, but the timing just happened to work out for this one. I was on a live stream anyway, so why not? And it actually looks like kind of an interesting presentation, to be honest. It's based off of this book called Palo Alto from Malcolm Harris. And it says, in Palo Alto, the first comprehensive global history of the Silicon Valley, Malcolm Harris examines how and why Northern California evolved in a particular consequential way it did, tracing the ideologies, technologies, and policies that have been engineered over the course of 150 years of Anglo-settler colonialism, from IQ tests to the tragedy of the commons, racial genetics, broken windows theory, the internet and computers too. It's a story of how a small American suburb became a powerful engine for economic growth and war, and how it came to lead the world into a surprisingly disastrous 21st century. And so I actually think that this actually sounds like an interesting presentation. Now, you do have to keep in mind, these are socialists. So there's going to be a lot of, I'm assuming, denouncing of capitalism. They're coming at it from a very specific perspective, but I thought that this would be a nice thing to stream to understand the perspective of the socialist. And so we will be getting started in about almost 7 minutes now. We got a little countdown going on, which is really great. Now, I want to do a couple things before we get started. Let me just set this up in my Chrome window so you can actually hear the sound when it starts. Okay, we're going to lay some ground rules, because I do have the stream pinned to the top of the chat. It's obvious, like, I'm streaming this anyway. I'm going to have the chat in the window up, and you can see I have already commented in their chat. I don't want any disruption. I don't want any shenanigans. I don't want any nonsense. I don't want to see anyone from my chat going over there and going, why are you guys engaging in capitalism if you're socialist? Because we already know the reason for that. I've explained it previously, all right? the reason that we watch socialism on my channel is because we want to learn their perspective. I want to listen to them. I want to hear what they have to say. I want to make sure that we're viewing it in its full context. And the reason I think this is fascinating is because I think that these people, not them specifically, but this particular brand of socialist, are leading the talking points of the Democratic Party. So if we take what they're talking about now and look 2, 3, 4 years down the road, those are going to be the talking points of the Democratic Party. So it's like very literally getting a sneak preview into the dystopian nonsense that we can expect. But that doesn't mean we have to be rude, okay? It doesn't mean we have to cause problems for them. I don't want to cause problems for them. I want them to say exactly and precisely what they want to say, because that's what this is about. It's about understanding the perspective. And so I'm going to ask very, very nicely that I don't want anyone creating nonsense in their chat on account of me, okay? I don't co-sign that, Philip. All right. Jen, thank you for the super chat. I actually went from elementary through high school and some college in Northern California, Sacramento, South Sacramento, although this was from 1986 through 1997, 98. I actually love Sacramento. I got this tattoo in Sacramento. It was a spur of the moment tattoo decision. But in Old Town, actually, I think Sacramento's a great city. I really do. And so we're going to listen to what they have to say about the development of Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, how the evils of capitalism have reared its head, and we're going to learn from it. And we can talk about it in the chat over here. Of course, I will also have their chat displayed on the screen. I should probably do all chat and not top chat. And guys, if this is going to be your first time listening to socialism, is anyone a newbie here? Has anyone not listened to socialism with me before? We do this every Saturday on Socialism Saturdays at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And so we do this as a very regular kind of weekly activity. We're doing it live today because it happens to be live. But here's what I'm going to tell you about socialism. If you have never listened to socialism before, it is going to sound like they are speaking in a completely different language. Oh, Mark Meets World is here. Hey, Mark. It is going to sound like they are speaking a completely different language because they are. Socialist is not, it's going to sound like English, but it is not English. It is in code. And so if you are having trouble understanding what they're saying, then please ask a question in the chat. We will try to help decode it for you. I'm pretty fluent in socialist now, so I know kind of what they're saying now. I can do a lot. The chat is really good at it. And the thing of it is, guys, is what I want you to know is you're not stupid if you don't understand what they're saying. It's not a you thing. It's just that we're speaking two different languages and we're going like this. Okay? I'm like the politics translator. I know how to speak leftist. I know how to speak socialist. I know how to speak Democrat. I know how to speak Republican. I know how to speak MAGA. I know how to speak conservative. I even know how to speak libertarian. They're all different languages. They all have different meanings. And part of the reason that I think listening to socialists is helpful is because when you learn how to speak their language, you see it show up in the real world. And you see how much their talking points are showing up in the real world. And, it just offers a little bit of a different perspective. So we are waiting right now for them to get started with the presentation. Again, I want to thank everyone for being nice in their chat. If you guys have questions that are like real questions, I don't see a problem with asking them. And I hope that Red May, if they're watching right now, hi, Philip. I hope that Red May would be open to answering questions because we are actually genuinely interested in what they have to say. And so I hope that Red May doesn't go blocking people who aren't trying to cause problems, just want to know what's going on. Terry, sadly, I can actually speak British because I had a really bad experience with a British narcissist. And he taught me how to speak British some like really, really good. So I can actually speak British a little bit anyway. Not with an accent though. All right, guys. So please mount that like button for me if you would be so kind. Let's make it a habit to mount the like button on the way in the door. And again, if you are interested in this, we do this regularly on Saturdays for Socialism Saturdays at 6 p.m. on the channel. If you are not subscribed to my channel already, I hope that you will consider subscribing today. I do live streams Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at 5 p.m. On Fridays, we actually do happy hour. So tomorrow at 5 p.m., we're going to be watching a woke training from start to finish. I've got an idea of what we're going to be watching. I haven't announced it yet, though, but I've got an idea. It's based back on something we did earlier this week. But we're going to be doing that tomorrow at 5 p.m. Grab some drinks. I bring some beer. And we have a great time with happy hour. And then on Saturdays, of course, Socialism Saturday at 6 p.m. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. And I hope to see you there. All right, it looks like we should be getting started with our friends from Red May anytime now. I got my knitting here. I'm going to do some knitting and some relaxing. Man, doing back-to-back streams, that was stressful. That was a lot. Yes, and I'm sure that at least half of them are us, but that's all right. That's all right. We can make new friends. That's what it's all about. Making new friends, learning some things, watching their chat, finding out what they think. It's important to be able to interact with the perspectives of other people, guys. It really, really is. It is important to be able to interact with the perspectives of other people, even if you don't agree with them. I don't agree with most of what these people say, although we do have some overlap. I don't like the police. I don't like the government. We might have some things that I don't care what people do with their bodies. I don't care if they're sex workers. I don't care if they take drugs. I don't care about any of these things. So you can always find overlap with anyone, you know. But I do think it's important to listen to people and to be ethically honest enough to try to figure out what their perspective actually is in a way that they would agree with. Otherwise, we're just posting assholes on the internet, and no one likes that. So, looks like everyone's being polite in the chat so far, which of course I do appreciate. Has this started yet? Nope, hasn't started yet. All right, well, we're still waiting, Red May. Yeah, I think this will be an interesting topic. I'm glad they're doing it. I think it's going to be great. Mark is making a great point. You can't change someone's mind if you don't listen to them first. And I don't even care about changing their minds. They just went live. So it's going to start in a second. I don't even care about changing their minds. I just want to understand what they think. I want to understand how they see the world. That's it. You can't change anyone's mind, guys. They have to want to change their own mind, you know? And you can't get people to want to change their own mind if you're shit posting and being disruptive and things like that. Like, if there's any ever hope of like getting these people to see that they're wrong, we have to be nice. All right, they're getting started. Hi, Philip. Hi. Oh, where'd it go? Philip, come back. Come on. Yay. Oh, okay.
All right, everybody, welcome to
Hi.
Red May 2023. We're very excited to see you all here. Thanks for joining us for our panel today, which is on Palo Alto, the book by Malcolm Harris. We have a full month of content for you that's both online and in person. And if you are interested in checking this out, please take a look at our website, redmayseattle.org. Right there. We have a full list of schedules and speakers for you to check out. Also, if you are interested in supporting our work and becoming a patron on our Patreon page, that would be very helpful so that we can continue to produce content all year round.
Sometimes they
for
have
you.
different
So you can do that at
volunteers.
Patreon.com.
How does my sound compare to theirs? Am I too loud?
Just
or
to
am I
give you
good?
a quick preview of some of the events that we have coming up this weekend. Saturday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, May 13th, we have our event Comedy Against Work, which is a book written by Madeline Lane McKinley, who will be joined by Ayla Ansari, Jack Bradich, and Dave Marr. And then Sunday at 11 a.m., May 14th, we have
There's
never
Yasmin
been
in the chat.
post-industrial. which is going to be a panel with Nick Chavez, Phil Neal, Wendy Liu, and Annette Ramos.
All right, sounds pretty good.
We'd also
Excellent.
like to let you know that we are co-producing this event, this Red May Seattle event, with the People and Things podcast hosted by Lee Vinsel, who is one of our guests today. So I will begin introducing the guests now, and we'll get on with this panel. So first and foremost, I'd like to welcome Malcolm Harris to the screen.
Hi, Malcolm.
Malcolm Harris is a freelance writer and the author of Palo Alto, the subject of today's talk. Also the author of Kids These Days, The Making of Millennials, and Shit is Fucked Up and Bullshit.
I would like to hear more about
Since
that book,
the End
too.
of History. He was born in Santa Cruz and graduated from the University of Maryland. We also have Lee Vinsel. So Lee is here on the screen with us now, and he studies human life with technology with a particular focus on the relationship between government, business, and technological change. His first book, Moving Violations, Automobiles, Experts, and Regulations, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2019, and also with his collaborator, Andy Russell. Vince Lee is the organizer and leads the Maintainers, which is a global interdisciplinary research network that examines maintenance, repair, and mundane work with technology. And then we have Malz Sauter, who is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland College of Information Studies. And the author of The Coming Swarm, DDoS Actions,
in higher ed,
and Civil Disobedience on the Internet.
Socialist.
They also have a new book coming out, which
non-binary.
Lee and Malz know a little bit more about than I do. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to our wonderful guests for a talk that I'm very excited to listen to. So please enjoy the show. And there should be some time at the end for comments. So if you have those, please go ahead and leave them in the live chat and the YouTube stream, and we'll do our best
to make
time to answer
university
professor. Thanks, everybody.
There'll definitely be time for Q&A at the end. Thanks, Kyle, for the introduction.
Very white background.
Kyle asked me if I wanted to get into conversation with Malcolm. And Malcolm and I had already been talking back in the day about him coming on my podcast, Peoples and Things. And Kyle also asked who else we should bring to the table. And I instantly thought of Malz Sauter. And I just wanted to kind of like set up the conversation a little bit by introducing Malz. So Malz is a really cool person. They organized a conference back in grad school called Innovation and Its Discontents, which was brought together all kinds of cool people thinking about the notion of innovation and, it's others, I guess. It's people were pushing back. Then at some point, Malz and I talked because they were going to write their
Socialists always suck with technology, guys. They always do. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do about it.
And then we ended up going in a different direction.
I can make it a little
different, very different.
Yeah. But we reconnected recently in Detroit at the Business History Conference, a great conference people should go to if they're into that kind of thing. And then we decided to put together a panel for the history, the Society for the History of Technology, which they should definitely take because it's great. And Malz, while we were together in Detroit, we were just talking about work and what we're reading and stuff. And they had just read Malcolm's book, and then you guys have met in other contexts. So Malz, can you tell people a little bit about your current book project? Because it is connected to this story in lots of ways. And I just thought it would be great for people to know about.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So the current book project is based on what the dissertation ended up being, which is the role of East Coast high finance in the development of the modern venture capitalist, and specifically in the development of modern venture capital policy. And I'm focusing pretty much on a small group of people based in DC and New York who were involved in a small business administration task force you get very specific in microhistory.
Thanks, Rosalind. It's going pretty good, actually. I'm not in a good place to show it right now, but I will.
Basically, they're led by William J. Casey, who's mostly well known for being the head of the CIA during Iran-Contra. But what very few people know about Casey was that before he was part of the CIA, he was a very sort of significant federal finance appointee, and he was the head of the SEC. He was the head of the Export-Import Bank. He did a lot of work in federal finance policy.
I would totally go on the stream with them.
part of the reason why he did that
I
was
can
sort of
speak
his
socialist. I would
very
do it.
interesting history in business publishing. He made all of his money in business publishing, sort of pre-World War II, and then was part of the OSS in World War II, and then basically spent his entire career trying to get back into being a spy because he thought being a spy was the best thing in the world. But he kept being pushed into these finance roles. And he is the head of this task force at the Small Business Administration to address the crisis in small business funding. Whether or not there is a crisis in small business funding is a valid question at the time. And they end up creating what is essentially the policy framework that gives us the modern venture capitalist, down to like cracking open pensions,
Exactly,
to make
Heidi.
pensions available
Exactly.
for high-risk investment,
Yeah.
changing some very significant SEC rules at a very specific time, changing some other different sort of taxation structures, and making what is known currently as the sort of limited partnership, institutionally supported venture capital firm, the dominant firm structure, sort of making that firm structure possible and then helping it to dominate the space. And so that's what the next book project is about. I
love it.
Yeah, I've been working on it for a while. We're shopping it to publishers now. We'll hopefully next, 18 months, academic timelines. We'll see how it goes.
Right on. Well, Malcolm, my buddy Aaron Gordon, a writer at Motherboard, and I are into the Oxford History of the U.S. series, like, because we love dad history books that are like 7 pages long, and like, I'm into that kind of thing. And so you wrote a dad history book about Palo Alto, right? So
unintentionally, on accident.
So I want to hear about the. Tell me, let's start there. How was it an accident?
Well, so, everyone, every young man just wants to be Joan Didion, and then you end up being dad history. No,
I told my editor, they're like, what kind of book do you want to write? I'm like, I want to write a smart dad history book. And they're like, is that a thing? And I'm like, yes, it is a thing. So I'm glad you're here blazing the trail for dad history books.
I wish I'd pitched it that way, because it definitely was not pitched at this length or even this form.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'm not sure if they would have bought it, because I don't... Unlike you two,
weirdos.
Lovely, talented, hardworking people, I don't have any graduate degrees.
You don't need a graduate degree to write a book, Malcolm.
Access the sort of authority to write this kind of straight history. It helps if you have some kind of personal connection that you're going to weave through, and then you can say, "Oh, I'm a good writer, so let me write this history because it's going to be like, autobiographical or whatever.
Yeah.
I read Sebald or Didion, or I'm going to do it like that." And a lot of people, or a fair number, I think, of writers in my cohort have taken that sort of institutional situation that's maybe not great, to be honest, right? And you look back at like the mid 20th century, you could be a 27-year-old who's just like got a mouth, and you can have the authority to write whatever you want. And a lot of our like very important texts come out of people just like talking shit like that. A little different now. But when I tried to do that kind of writing, it didn't really work. And I did a fair amount of it. And so I have the files on my computer somewhere where I'm weaving my personal childhood experience, 8 through 18 that I spent in Palo Alto.
Socialists are very wordy, guys.
Of this place.
They'll get to the point eventually. We just need to be patient.
And a few things happened, which is that, I didn't like doing it. I don't think I'm very good at it. I don't think it read very well. Like kind of absurd almost, the like juxtaposition of this history that I was doing. And I was finding a lot more straight history stuff that I wanted to tell than I expected to in the first place. And so when I wrote my first chapter out, doing a straight history chapter, it was 3 times as long as I planned it to be. And I had this really, dense outline that I was committed to doing this whole story straight through and not taking any sort of metaphorical jumps through
Happy
the
birthday,
decades,
Kaiwan.
Actually doing
We're glad you're spending some time with us.
Decade by decade. That it was just all going to be 3 times as long as I originally planned, even without any personal stuff. So luckily, I have a great editor at Little Brown, and she agreed with me that the other stuff wasn't as good, and that the straight history was working better. And she let me I still can't believe that they published it at the size that they did. Like, it's totally surreal. This, just like as an object to me, it's totally surreal.
If you're explaining it to a stranger, what do you say it's about, and what were you trying to do with this thing?
Well, it depends, like the context in which I meet the stranger, right? Yeah. But mostly, if a totally, Rawlsian blank slate person that I were to encounter, I tell them that it's a straight history all the way through of Palo Alto, California, from its founding in the 1870s and pre-founding in the gold rush.
Oliver, tell Red May you were just responding to someone else in the chat.
No one had tried to write this book before. And that's like the dad history, straight up, like it's
you're not doing anything wrong.
To now.
Red May, chill out. Come on.
America and world development and the development of the capitalist world system through this place, Palo Alto, California, step by step through the whole thing from then till now. And it was this part. The way I came to think about it was that
socialists just want to control the
part
chat.
Of this
they want to control
rewriting
everything.
of American history that we've been doing lately, a re-examination of the post-Reconstruction era and the sort of second American history that starts then. And California hasn't been told as part of that history. We look to, this continue in terms of this model of the relationships between the South and the North into the late 19th into the 20th century.
They're talking about the development of the Silicon Valley from a socialist
rushes
perspective.
onto the scene
in
that period and makes an immediate difference.
Does that make sense?
And so much of it clicks for me when you see that, California teams up with the South to end Reconstruction, to end the occupation of the South in order to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that these racialist logics and that were so tied up with the labor markets and labor costs were mutually reinforcing, from this moment at the end of the 19th century that is constitutive and foundational for this second American history. So maybe I'd go into that stuff depending on read the 1619 Project, or
the
compare it, you do
historically
comps,
inaccurate 1619
you're selling
project.
it to your editor versus selling it to an editor.
Miles was picking up on this haunting theme in our conversation. Miles, why don't you kick it over there?
Yeah, so I really love the beginning of the book where you're talking about the haunting and how Palo Alto is haunted, California is haunted by these crimes of the past that can not only
What
can
crimes?
they never be atoned for, but also they are always constantly present.
What crimes?
But there isn't another sort of way of thinking about haunting and sort of hauntology as you're haunted by lost futures. You're haunted by the things that you cannot have that have been foreclosed to you.
They like to make up words, don't they?
In the past, and sort of both this is a thing that the region is haunted by this, the people are haunted by this, the children that you talk about are haunted by this, the fucking horses are haunted by this.
Can someone please ask what they're haunted by? Talk a little bit about
how the foreclosure of futures, or
very
maybe
nicely,
the over-defining of
what are they
futures
saying they're haunted by?
How futures are foreclosed through this over-defining of potential works in this text.
Yeah, there are some interesting moments where you see sort of attempts at different things throughout the history, whether that's, the halcyon commune in California, where you've got poets and engineers and immigrants and agriculturalists working together under a pretty sort of utopian model. And there are lots of projects like that in California.
Thank you, Radical Moderate.
And a bunch that I didn't know, so many early, really at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century political projects in California and Palo Alto. I knew there was a new left presence, but before that, I didn't know much about the old left and even the First International, right? And a figure like Har Dayal, who leads this uprising of East Indian agricultural workers on the west coast of North America, as an army that they are anti-colonial army that they put on boats and lead on a struggle against the British occupation, and is foundational to the history of anti-colonial struggle in the 20th century.
No, I can't see you, Trendle.
I had no idea Palo Alto played a role in that, and that they were organizing out of a shack near the railroad, and that they Stanford got sort of tricked into
them here, not over there.
The auspices for this kind of thing. The Radical Anarchist Communist Revolutionary Society, the coolest name that you could think of. Right? Real crazy folks doing really exciting things, and founding, being involved in the foundations of the first communist parties around the world. And it's really like the international Pacific left that we're coming to understand a little bit more.
The international Pacific
I think
left.
that the political history of California is haunted by that, but maybe not in such a bad way. I don't know. I think like that the left-wing tradition of California communism is something that I think we need to like develop further. And if people just started noticing now, I think, which makes sense because Alta California, Anglo-American Alta California, is only
California
200
communism.
years old, not even. And so now we're looking like at the political traditions that are coming out of that history. I think there's going to be more. We're going to come to understand them more, and they're going to be more important as we go on. So
I would like to know more about
by
the
that. I know what you're talking about.
California
The failure of the Soviet Union sort of haunts the left, and I guess is the thesis. But California was really an exception to that experience in a lot of ways. Like the American Communist Party in general, their hands are not very bloody, honestly, with the crimes of 20th century communism, partly because they just weren't very powerful. So they just like worked for civil rights a lot of the time and like can generally take a lot of pride in what they did. And the California communists were even on the far end of that. So like when the communists kicked out the Japanese because they didn't want to like look bad, like they were collaborating with the Japanese, the California communists said, yeah, okay, we're still going to let all our Japanese members contribute the same way that they were going to. And like they were even like more.
That's a great idea, Bree. Maybe I can try to reach out to him. Wouldn't that be something?
Which I think like is part of the reason we have this left-wing communist tradition and perspective that continues out of California, and that's exemplified in someone like Mike Davis and his work. That seems strange in the history of like left-wing thought, but then when you put it in the history of California left-wing thought, he's like right in there. It makes total sense, and he's done so much of that work explaining sort of himself and where he comes from. And I definitely see this work as aspiring to be in that tradition and help cast more light on that history.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Miles, keep going.
Well, so I think a lot about venture, obviously, and sort of what venture is and the processes of venture. And one thing I've been thinking about recently is like, what is valuation? Like, what is evaluation? How do you work evaluation?
How funny the socialist is studying venture capital.
And one of the things that I've been thinking about sort of in conversation with this text is valuation is a process of dragging the future into the present and draining it and like hollowing it out and like making exploitative use of the future now.
Yeah.
And that I see happening in like at every level of this text is that the Palo Alto system is about nailing down potential and like materializing it in a way that is deeply sort of creepy once you start to think about it. Yeah, I agree with this, and like it has that weird sort of bad magic on top of it, where it's like you're taking something that is supposed to be airy and like in the future and something that is aspirational and something that is a thing that you go out and you experience, and you are instead concretizing it in the present. And there's something deeply weird and bad magic about that.
And getting something out of it, right?
Thanks, Sharon.
Getting something out of it.
Getting something out of it in a way that steals something from someone later.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is. It's about taking the value from the future and spending it now.
But I think it was helpful for me, and I think we got over 20 minutes in before I say the name Herbert Hoover, which
Herbert
I think is pretty
Hoover's here.
He's, that's his music. It was helpful to me to understand the capitalist's perspective, to see how it's supposed to work in their thinking, how this mechanism, finance mechanism is supposed to work.
What do you think they think, Malcolm?
Because they are thinking about, you take value from the future and you bring it to today, but it's not supposed to steal it from the future, right? It's supposed to be like a stepping stool so that you fake it till you make it.
It's supposed to sort of multiply it. It's supposed to be
that's
more.
Not what it is.
That if you can count on it being there in 2 years, you can borrow against it now and get you to that 2 years, right? You can tell a story about where you're going that helps you, along that path. And seeing the built-in, Herbert Hoover doesn't get much credit. And I do think it's funny that some of the reviews think that this book is just like solely, I mean, it is anti-capitalist, but they think the like examination of capital and capitalists is very like one-sided, and that I'm just looking at like Leland Stanford, who's a goof or whatever. But like Herbert Hoover as president and as commerce secretary was very successful at using these finance mechanisms for some very important stuff. And so Roosevelt gets a lot of credit for the airplane industry, right? And for like switching over the factory systems to build airplanes. And this is a strong feat of government leadership, the opposite of for finance-led development or whatever. But Hoover, it was really Hoover is the one who triggered the air boom, right? There was no reason for the United States to be a leader in airplanes necessarily at that time. And it was Hoover who like, and his cabal of associates, right? And like, and finance capital on the East Coast that piled into airline stocks and says, we're going to make this happen, that this is a strategic importance. And that it wasn't about government investment for him, but was about like government mediation in creating the
associationalism is
exactly the opportunities for people to get along and make it happen. And the Guggenheims played the central role, including hiring Lindbergh to fly around and promote flying airplanes. And this seems like such a very contemporary move, right? Is like you get they not only got Lindbergh to do it, but paid him in stock. And so that he becomes a promoter, a stock promoter for the airplane. Like, this is genius. Yeah. Like, you can get the flight to pay for itself, and this is very successful. This builds the airline, like the air industry, and of course with government contracts, they're giving mail contracts very selectively to the companies that they want to support. Hoover specifically is giving it to his friends, and they're developing the avionics industry, and they were developing the federal government is still like building the apparatus that allows
corporatism
for
with
the
capitalism.
Capitalist association
or
to
they
make
think
these investments.
It's inevitable
mapping,
capitalism will be corrupted.
Scientific research, instrument research, that they're all.
Which I can kind of understand that argument, but that's no excuse to be a Marxist.
Supporting these efforts. Yep.
And they're all in the Department of Commerce, where Herbert Hoover has put them, and where he's overseen them, and where he's brought the interested parties in to come and decide these things, right, together. And so this was the model of finance associationalism and how it was supposed to work, right? And so they did. It wasn't just a story that they told themselves about why they were getting rich and that they were just scamming people, sort of like it was for Leland Stanford and the railroad guys, the original associationists. But so when Wall Street collapses, when this all doesn't work, right? When the Great Depression hits. And all which is really due to the profligacy of these financiers that Hoover is trying to cool down, that he's saying come on guys, if this is going to work, we all have to be cool.
They never listened to the poor guy,
And they didn't listen to him. And it was FDR who had just as much authority and sort of presence to tell them to cool it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it all blows up, and he's held responsible. And so he feels really betrayed, and also personally betrayed by DuPont, by Hearst, by some of these big capitalists who abandoned him for Roosevelt, as if he wasn't their guy. And so he gets very bitter.
It's very sad. Herbert's story is a very sad one, I think.
The non-binary
I wrote about
person
him
has
too
a
in my
very
first book,
capitalist
and
walk.
I'm a huge. So your Hoover chapter, it was beautiful. I want to give the people who are watching a little bit of sense of how your book moves, including kind of just walking through some of the history. And just giving, sketching it out a bit. But I'm also picked up on another great thing. That's kind of what we were on the phone calling anti great man history. And so I want to make sure to get this on the record, and then about settler stuff.
Now that we cracked the seal on Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, exactly.
I think all of us are working on projects, or have recently been working on projects, where we are delving pretty deeply into the psychology of specific people.
Yep.
Where you've got Herbert Hoover.
None of you actually understand psychology. I promise you.
Continually refer to as my favorite monster. And I'm interested in what his what his internal state is, why he made these series of choices, what his motivations are, how you can see those motivations in like the things he writes and the policies he tries to pass. And I just wanted to open the door for you to talk a little bit about writing a Marxist history, which has traditionally been sort of very systemic, that pays so much attention to the specificities, the personalities, the traumas, and like this, then the historical specificity.
I like how they're talking about a Marxist history
sort of
as though that's like a real thing and not
history.
something that they just made up to advance a narrative.
Yeah, that is a great question. Because I've seen some people, in some of the like reviews or something, some people have called it like history from below or referred to it that way because there are stories about workers organizing in there. Which, like, that's an important historical tradition and a very valuable one. And I've read a bunch of those and incorporated their insights into this book, but that's not
they did forget their pronouns.
This book is working.
How inconsiderate of them.
This is for me a history of capital relations. And so that means you're going to have a bunch of capitalists and you're going to have a bunch of workers, right? And it's not a like exhaustive perspective. There are a lot of things that this book doesn't do, obviously. Even at
like engage
sort of
with
the
reality
max length. I tell people that Google Docs cut me off, which is true. There's a character limit on Google Docs.
You found it.
If I found it, they'll cut you off. And to do that, I found that like someone like Herbert Hoover, I had to talk about a lot. And I found myself frustrated by that because I wasn't planning on it.
But what did you say?
All.
I wanted to walk through.
I wanted to like skip World War II as a like, haha, like, see, you think I would talk about that, but I'm going to talk about something else. Also did not work. Because these things are very important from the perspective that I'm approaching the topic from. And Herbert Hoover becomes important not just because he like personally makes a lot of relevant choices.
No land acknowledgement. You're right. Failing on every level today, socialists. Come on, we expect more from
Palo
you.
Alto
We do.
onto the national and global stage personally, and like becomes the president and whatever. In his embodiment of these historical forces, like he encounters other historical forces, and that's what's so interesting for me is that like as an embodiment and avatar of capital, he like personally encounters the historical phenomenon of class struggle as something in his life, right? So it's not like they are taking the minds, it's they're taking my minds. And he experiences not just like one uprising, but because his interests are so global and because he has associates everywhere, the world anti-colonial movement, the world communist movement is personal for him. And then it becomes literally personal for him because they're also showing up at his personal doorstep. Whether that's the Hoover Farm in California, which is I
guess I need to learn more about Herbert Hoover because I really don't know that much about him. What do I need to know about Herbert Hoover? I'm asking in the chat.
In the 30s and the farm uprisings in California at the Hoover Farm.
This is what happens with socialism,
as well as the bonus march at the White House.
They want to pour us into not listening. Is the problem?
You can watch the video. People should like look up the video of this stuff, which is crazy. On the bonus marchers,
thank you, Brock.
Which were some American soldiers. This is one we like learn in American history because it sort of closes the door on the Hoover story, is that during the Depression, you have these American soldiers who march on the White House asking to get their bonus payments that they're owed early, veterans from World War I. And Hoover, sort of inexplicably, as far as the regular American history class is concerned, attacks them with the military. Specifically, Douglas MacArthur leads the military to attack their own soldiers and burns their camp, and it's like brutal. And it, seals Hoover's fate against FDR or whatever. But from his perspective, after seeing it in the context of these global uprisings, to me, it made a lot of sense.
How did he do that?
He was like, there they are. Like they're storming the Winter Palace. Like the poor soldiers are here. They're communists, right? And so he interpreted things in terms of these historical phenomena because he was himself.
I'm going to mute them for a second. I want to make a point. Half Orc Fighter says, I'm severely resisting the urge right now to hop on a Call of Duty like game. And I understand that, guys. But what I need you to hear is part of their goal is to bore us into not listening. Now, this is a little bit different than we usually listen to. This is not as dystopian as usual, but I still think we're gonna get some gems out of it. And if you want to go do something else, that's cool, man. It's your life. You're allowed to do whatever you want to do. But the goal is to bore us into not listening. Okay? Because when we turn our brains off, that's where they say the only things that matter. So up to you. The stream will always be here if you want to listen.
Really, it's like Steve Jobs thought this way, and so that's how he got that job. Like, he was performing a particular function to these historical forces, and so that's how I want to understand him. What that does lead to, though, and that people, I think some maybe
these are more generalized woke,
that,
aren't they? Not socialist, more
capital
woke.
Gets personified in these individuals, and then labor tends to sort of disappear into groups.
Exactly.
And so capital becomes, paradoxically more human than labor, which has much more people, right?
That's really interesting, yeah.
And it's sort of true, but I don't think that's necessarily we shouldn't associate, I don't think, like, being humanized in these kind of histories as
it's a tough one. Yeah.
Morally positive necessarily. People are like, oh, he's really humanized. And so I tried to dehumanize the very human characters that we understand, right? And so someone like Shockley or someone like Hoover, they're very important as individuals, but their characteristics are so determined, right? And if they weren't there, somebody else would have been there instead of them. And I think that's sort of doesn't make them seem more important. It makes them contextual.
Yeah.
So I want to give a sense how you kick the book off historically, but I think because the story of indigenous people comes up in your intro, you return to it at the end of the book. It's clearly a really important issue. I think we should get that on the table before we do a little section hopping. But Malls, why don't you had a nice way of putting that, so hop on.
Well, this I'm going to pull right from the event that you did at UMD last week that I went about the anxiety of settlerism and the anxiety of the settler and anxiety of settler colonialism. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit about how this is an ongoing fact. This is an ongoing activity. This isn't something that happened and is now over and now we have to clean up the mess. It's no, it's a thing that is still occurring. And so I wanted to know if you would just talk a little bit about sort of the persistence of settlerism, the persistence of the colonial agenda, and sort of the persistence of that anxiety.
Yeah. One place that's interesting to look at and a place to start is the Stanford University land acknowledgement. And so people should Google that because it's a very interesting webpage, because they acknowledge the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, which is a politically constituted organization. Now I believe has 614 members, I believe, all of whom have a genetic tie to remains that are millennia old in the Bay Area, right? These are, tribal members of a tribe that Stanford acknowledges as the ancestral title holders. But not only do they acknowledge them, but the page itself includes some rhetoric about how the rhetoric of land acknowledgements is insufficient, and that we need to look at the return of land and land back, quote unquote, and has a link to more information about returning land, which I think is interesting because it does speak to that anxiety.
They're talking about reparations, not only just reparations.
Is one thing to acknowledge, but then you still feel anxious about the acknowledgement, and then you have to say okay, well, I feel bad about that. It should be more than that. But then they can't do the thing that is actually returning the land. And so they do everything else, right? Which is they name stuff after things.
Yeah.
They change names of things. They,
we get stuck there. I mean, I think that shit's good. Change the name of things.
They should change the name of things. They should change, but then the question is, are you going to change the name of Stanford University? And they're not going to, right?
No.
Stanford, Leland Stanford was personally responsible for, signing genocide checks, basically. They're not going to take his name. It's not going to be the Muwekma Ohlone University, because then the Muwekma Ohlone, you just say, okay, are we going to be in charge of the
question? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
And this is a tribal organization that's still fighting for federal recognition, but does have recognition from Stanford University, which has returned remains to the tribal organization, even though they don't have federal recognition. And what the feds say is, we recognize that you used to be a tribe, that you were a tribe, in the 19th century, and that in the beginning of the 20th century, you a group of people, you're keeping your traditions up, etc. And then like the Great Depression, World War II, what happened to you guys? Like, we don't know. And then you pop up again in the 80s, and then we recognize you again in the 80s. But we don't want to hear anything about before this time or after this time. We only want evidence from this middle period that shows your tribal existence, through a time of like national upheaval,
or perhaps
and
they
a time
just think
when
it's a completely impractical
natives in
solution
California were
given
being
where we are
Hispanicized,
today.
right? We're being treated as
And there is
Chicano,
no need
Chicana,
to completely disrupt the system
Mexicans,
we have today.
even though
That
they
would be my guess.
lived in the same land for centuries, millennia.
Whatever.
And so then it becomes a struggle to produce not just documents showing, okay, we were a tribe and we're a tribe, but this middle period of we were a tribe at every moment through that period. So that's where the struggle for the
Red
Marxist
May
is
is
going
so
on
effing
right now,
persnickety
and
in
it
their
is. It's
chat.
ongoing
Anyone
to this
chats
day,
in
right?
anything, and they're like, right on
this
it.
coming weekend.
Like, I literally told people to be polite, and they're still like,
organization will take
they're
part,
finicky.
right? It's recognized by the university. And so I start with
relevant to
the
what?
dispossession
That's a great
of
question, because they're not even
the
saying anything.
indigenous people of Alta California, and then I end with the continued dispossession of the indigenous people of Alta California, and show that this struggle for land, for sovereignty, for territory has gone on throughout this history of the tech industry, and that you have like redevelopment that's going on in downtown San Jose in the 80s that's being driven directly, not just driven by the tech industry, but being driven by Steve Jobs personally meeting with the mayor of San Jose saying, oh, we're going to move our headquarters here.
How is that not relevant?
Whatever. And the construction of that redevelopment in that interest is digging up remains that then lead to struggle over this territory. And that this needs to be written as part of the same history and into today as part of the same history. So major effort of the book, and I think a continuing effort politically that I want to continue being involved in as a result of the book.
That's great, man. And so the first part the first section starts in 1850. I mean, and it covers 1850 to 1900. So set the scene for the folks who haven't read it yet. What's the scene? What's the first shot?
So you get the gold rush, but I try and give this is where Alta California history starts, generally with the gold rush. You point back to the Spanish missionary period a little bit, so that you like blame the death of indigenous people on the Spanish.
So why are we getting
so that
land
when we
back?
showed up, we were just kicking out, those other colonizers, and there were like 12 of them, so it's fine.
Can someone ask if do they believe in private property if they believe in giving the land back?
The United States, which as a military campaign is extremely goofy. Like the Bear Flag Republic stuff is like super, like real bunch of guys with some guns
constitute it being private property?
And the reason that they're able to take this giant and very historically consequential territory is that Alta California was the furthest corner of the world as far as Western capital was concerned at this point. Mm-hmm. That it was like the colonization of Alta California by the Spanish was very coastal, very thin. The missions couldn't absorb that much indigenous labor. And so they did kill a lot of people, roughly half the indigenous population with disease, but there were still 150,000 indigenous people in California at the time of the American takeover that constituted the bulk of the population, and then who still had a traditional relationship to the land for the most part. And so you have to commit genocide.
Oh, I'm going to bet
and
they
a lot of this
don't
happens
believe in
during
national parks.
The Civil War, and we don't think of it. It's sort of hidden historically by what else was going on in the country.
Thank you, Jen.
And written out of that period. But Leland Stanford, the railroad baron, who is the embodiment of capital in the West, and really put out as this embodiment of capital in the West by his associates who were more competent than he was, and who recognized that being out in front at that time of history was maybe not the best idea. were responsible for this and then profited from
You're
it
going
directly.
to Disneyland, Vince?
To
How
tie it
dare
into our
you?
last question.
How dare you go and ride rides and
Beautiful.
have fun?
Miles, what are you thinking?
I think it's time to talk about horses.
All right. The
Is it
first,
horse time?
the beginning of Palo Alto. Well, so to get to horses, though, we have to start with the railroad. So Leland Stanford is this embodiment of capital in the West in the
People are getting involved
1870s.
now.
And
People are
being
like,
the embodiment
"Make
of
a
capital
point."
anywhere in the 1870s is a high-risk job. Because workers are all being proletarianized and they're very angry. And the Working
Workers
Men's
are
Party,
being
which was the California
proletarianized.
affiliate of the First International, was no exception. Bunch of angry guys, specifically angry, and they were a white group of guys, were angry at Stanford and the other associates for bringing in Chinese laborers to complete the transcontinental, which affected their place in the labor market, which they understand correctly as affecting their place in the labor market. And so they would organize outside Leland Stanford's house, which was on the top of Nob Hill. We call Nob Hill now in San Francisco, and yell at him and say, "We're going to come get you," and like, "Come down or we're going to get you." And he was very like blasé because he was kind of a dumbass about that threat. And he was like, there's this great scene that this journalist records where like the workers are outside the window shouting at him, and Stanford is showing the journalist
leg to stand
these
on
vases that he got
because
that
everyone's
used to
asking
belong to
questions
Marie
directly based
Antoinette.
on things they're saying.
Like, check out these beautiful vases. Like, aren't these cool? And the journalist was like, "Yeah, man. Like, I don't know though.
Look at these
Are you
historically
sure?"
resonant vases.
I know. And he's like, "Do you think they might be haunted?" Speaking of haunt, and he writes about it. He's like, "Yeah, I don't know. You should like find something else to do with that or whatever."
Man.
Well, and it turns sad a little bit when his firstborn son dies in a very like sort of biblical curse moment. His only child, but before that, he has to do what a lot of rich people do when they live in the city and their workers like won't stop yelling at them, which is move his family to the suburbs. Except the suburbs in the 1870s don't exist yet, and so he has to create his own suburb to move his family to escape the class tension that he has also created. And that is the origin of the town of Palo Alto, which is the suburb that he creates to move his family to. But what do you do in the suburb that you moved your family to? Leland Stanford sets about building the biggest and most excellent horse stock farm in the world in Palo Alto. And this is a subject that he'd been interested in before. And the stock farm is most famous, especially in science and technology studies, which maybe some people in the audience might be from, for yielding the photographs of Edward Muybridge, which are the first moving pictures, which lead to the technology of motion pictures. And so the Stanford horse breeding whole complex is treated as like the thing that led to Muybridge's motion pictures. And Stanford was sort of this like rich guy who funded those because he was frivolous. There's a story about how it was about gambling, that he was betting whether all four hooves were off the ground at the same time. That wasn't true. He was involved in a very important scientific project, which was improving scientific commercial national project, which was creating a better horse. And he was really into horse breeding and horse training.
We are their audience,
at the
and they
time
won't even answer our
were
questions.
very important. And
You're welcome,
the
Red May.
transition to coal-based energy hadn't really happened yet. And so you have horses are crucially important in transportation, in canals and streetcars. They're dragging stuff through the canals. They're dragging streetcars. Agricultural implements. They're pulling plows through the fields. As a military, they're pulling cannons and artillery and stuff. It's like they were the engines of the country.
Yeah, for sure.
Even in mines, if they're like crushing for a quartz mine, you're driving those by horses or mule. And so they were the engines of the country and of the world. And Leland Stanford, like a good disruptor, says, I know this is a millennia old technology, the trotting horse, horse carriages. I'm going to reinvent it. I can scale. I can do things that no one else can do. I'm going to create a new horse. And he says, there are 1.3 million horses in the United States, or no, there are 13. I got to remember my numbers correctly. There are 13 million horses in the United States. If I can improve them all by $100 each in their value, that's worth 1.3 billion to the country. And this is classic like VC logic. As if you scale this out, if you look at the number, it goes
everyone
up,
signs up for the thing. We get the hockey stick.
If every horse becomes $100 better, the country is going to be that much. And this was a major concern. There had been the Great Epizootic, which is a national horse influenza epidemic that kills 1% of American horses and incapacitates basically
They're
all
really
of the
arguing
horses.
that we should never make technological improvements in how we do
because
things
the horses
because that's
drag
capitalism
the
and that's bad.
Fire engines.
That's what they're arguing
and you
right
can't
now.
have the fire engines, and people are like dragging the streetcars. Streetcar operators are dragging.
I don't know if you guys could hear me just then because it does seem a little bit loud, but I just want to say he is literally arguing that we should never make technological advances in how we produce things, like taking horses and then saying maybe I can produce more than I can with a single horse if I do this a different way. He's saying that's bad because capitalism is bad.
Are like important functions. But Stanford succeeds in what they call the Palo Alto system, which is creating this new kind of horse. And they're taking inspiration from Germany, where they're doing early childhood education for the first time with these kindergartens.
They're against any innovation
so he builds a kindergarten track.
That's right.
He says, instead of letting horses, get older before we try and find out how fast the fastest ones are, we're going to race them as young as possible. And then we're going to invest a ton of money in the most successful ones. And then we're going to sell their genetic material. And so it's a very, it doesn't matter that we're going to ruin a bunch of very expensive horses in the process because of our scale and our investment. We can afford to do it. And they call the system the Palo Alto system. And it's immediately
rules for
very,
thee, but not
very,
for me.
very successful and produces some of the
or
fastest
rules for me, but not for thee.
Trotting horses in the world, the fastest, youngest trotting horses in the world, specifically.
I'm asking people not to be disruptive.
From Twitter, from someone whose name I did not write down.
There are questions in the
which
chat.
I should have. But it was essentially a sort of, what does it mean for a city to give its name to a system? And in this case, it's really interesting because the system gets named after not the city yet. And sort of the city grows up in the shadow of the system itself. And so it's almost like the city is named after the system. So what does it like? I would love to talk a bit about like the power, like names have power, like the power of naming and how we are seeing the system and the city come up together in a very intertwined way.
Yeah, I was surprised when I was writing this. I mean, so that was the original, one of the earlier titles for the book, the prospective titles for the book, right, was the Palo Alto system, which ended up sounding too like business-like, right? Doesn't that sound like a VC book? And I thought that was maybe like
can't
cool.
have it sound capitalist.
The Palo Alto system, you bought the wrong book, sucker. I was surprised that it hadn't been used this way much throughout the literature, like the regional business literature.
Don't try to own them. Like, don't ruin it. We've got a full month of this.
Anecdote.
There'll be many more chances.
That they use and name that Charles Marvin, and who is the lead trainer at the stock farm, and Leland Stanford come up with and use, that speaks to so much of what goes on in this region and the regional business ecosystem into the future. That people hadn't been using it this way in the past.
I like Radical Moderate's
partly
question,
because it was kind of obscure.
It's a good, dumb question.
And again, Muybridge so dominates our understanding of those events, partly because he was really good at self-branding and found a way to tell the story and make it about him constantly. And there have been some good books about so Rebecca Solnit's book about Muybridge is really good. There are there are more books about Muybridge and Stanford and Muybridge period than there are about Stanford, even though he's a governor and senator and he does all this important stuff. Muybridge is such an interesting historical figure that he really dominates that period. And so people, even when people want to do metaphorical jumps about Palo Alto from the 19th century or early 20th century to now or to the post-war, they'll usually take that one because it's a good story. But the Palo Alto system, I think, is just like the best metaphor for the area, and speaks so much to the like impersonal injunctions and values that characterize the place and structure its history into the present. And so like when I read about the Palo Alto system, I was like, it was a moment of instant recognition in a sort of like chilly way. And I've talked to other people from Palo Alto, young people who grew up there, who read about this story about them saying like, oh, well, it's okay to work the young horses as fast as possible, because if they break, then they were never really that good in the first place.
Thank you, Jen.
And having young, with the story of this high youth suicide rate that I start the book with, that's creepy, that there's a talk about haunting, right? That's hugely resonant into the present. But it's not that like people understood the Palo Alto system by that name and continued to use it. So like people, unless they read this book,
you just got to listen to it a couple more times, Tim. You're going to get it. Like this it is speaking a different language.
Palo Alto region, like it's not part of the official history. And Palo Alto is somewhere that's got a really deep official history. For someone that like their whole history is very narrow, or for a place.
That's a great question, Radical Moderate. He says, did the Palo Alto system of breeding horses work?
History, I mean,
did it breed better, stronger horses? Great question.
Alta California, Anglo-American Alta California, much shorter period of time.
You won't
and
have
yet
to
it's got a very
learn how to speak
closely written official history that capitalists have spent a fair amount of money, funding. And so you can find there like Bank of America is writing its own history books like very early. So a lot of our history of Bank of America comes from Bank of America funded history into the present, where like the recent book about the Stuart Brand history that Markov wrote is like written in association with a group of guys who are involved in the history that they're telling, and so there becomes this pretty well-defined official history, and people just read the same books or read the same oral histories or listen to the same speeches and then ask the same guys, what do you remember about that time? And they'll tell you about the things that they remember from the book that they read about the thing that they did at the time. And it creates this unfortunate loop, and the Palo Alto system is not part of that official history, but that's too bad. They should work that in there.
They really should. It's so creepy.
So I think we should keep walking forward through the book because there's so much great stuff. And I mean, two things, Malcolm. First of all, it's a beautifully written book. I really like it's written in a voice where it's just a wonderful example.
Why does this guy sound like a cartoon?
It's really detailed in a great way. So there's no way we can do justice to a 700-page book with all these great stories in an hour. There's no way. But I do want to keep walking. I will keep an eye on the comments. If people have high quality comments, we'll turn to those.
We have questions all over in the chat right now.
And we'll turn to any questions folks have if they have good ones. And
I want everyone
I like
to
that
ask
standard. Any questions you got, as long as they're good.
Because
there are in fact stupid questions.
Your entire audience right now, you just called your entire audience stupid.
I love the late 19th century stuff. It's great. I mean, it's just classic robber baron. And I mean, like you're not telling that kind of simplistic story, but it's this late 19th century industrialist stuff. The period from 1900 to 1945, I feel like in some ways this is the gap in my understanding in sometimes in this history of like told earlier. There's I was thinking about O'Mara's history. We could talk about how you related your book to other books that were around. But I was just wondering, like, what did you want to get across to people from this, like, 1900 to 1945? You cover there's Raisin Ku Klux Klan and IQ stuff. This is where Herbert Hoover comes in, of course. But then we get to tubes, and so I wonder, like, what kind of transformations are going on in this period that you think are really important for people to know about?
The socialists
the radio age
is
really important, and
even when I have given them their entire audience, really you're welcome.
So one of my side quest type goals for the book, I had a bunch of them, but one was to get people, if they wanted to, you don't have to do this stuff to read the book if you don't want to, but to actually understand the technical evolution of how you go from a light bulb style triode to a semiconductor-based computer, and what that technical progression looks like, and how it's much shorter than you might imagine, right? That like a semiconductor-based transistor, a point contact transistor or whatever, is a triode, which is the same thing that they were building in the radio age in Palo Alto. And it's built by Federal Telegraph, and that these things are not like metaphorically connected or whatever, but very directly connected. And I think the history, most of the histories of the area take a jump around there, right? Whether it's the beginning of the 20th century,
I thought your question was great,
or
Allotrope.
like maybe they dip into the radio age a little bit, or they talk about Charles Lytton and the tubes a little bit, and the beginning of Hewlett Packard.
We're coming in good faith. They're the
Sometimes
ones that
they'll
aren't
start with
playing.
Hewlett Packard, they get to the radio age, or they talk about Frederick Terman is very important, obviously.
It's not our fault they can't recruit an audience. And
but for me, it was really
important
to tell that story all the way through in its global context, because that was the context that matters for me.
Yeah.
And so what's going on in those years is a like global struggle about the future of the world.
And it's one concept of private property for future enforcement. That's a great question.
And so it's in that context that we can see these devices, right? Because they're building all these devices, and that's the official history centers around these devices, as if there's sort of some natural progression of these devices towards the devices that we have now.
Yeah.
And we need to like read it backwards through the progression, like evolutionarily or whatever. But if you do it through the anxieties of Herbert Hoover and his buddies in the beginning of the 20th century, you'll see that they had some real problems. That the 20th century, that period for them was a very anxious one, especially between World War I and the end of the period that I'm talking about in the book. Where and through the post-colonial period that talk about is where they really have to act on their understanding of the world, where the position
they're
of
absolutely
these guys,
going to ignore every
some white
single
engineer
question
guys
they're
in
being
California
asked, which speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Threatened.
These people are
this
completely
idea that they are going to
of
continue
interacting
to
with good
occupy
faith
this like vaunted
questions that
perch on top of the world did not seem exceptionally plausible at a time when
the non-binary
you've
is
got a global
getting
communist
totally
movement that's on the march,
100% triggered.
Colonial movement that's on the march.
Because I called Day out for calling everyone
And from their
stupid.
perspective, the natural progression that's going on wasn't to the personal computer or whatever. It was towards communism and the liberation of all peoples and like world equality. That like the liberalism of the 18th and 19th century was being expanded to a world where everyone knew about each other, and that the extension of that was going to be the elimination of privilege based on nationality, privilege based on skin, privilege based on region. That seemed obvious to not just them, but to many people throughout the world, right? This seemed to be the obvious sequence of history, and was for them a deeply threatening thing, and clearly the most important thing that was going on in the world. And so when you see them in that context, the devices that they end up coming up with make a lot more
that they would only take good questions,
not just as
stupid
some natural
questions. And I was like, there's a full list of questions in your chat, mother effers, that are good faith, good
that
questions.
Humans figure out,
called everyone who would ask the questions
and this is Silicon Valley loves to talk about itself that way, right? That like there's fire, there's the wheel, and then we came up with the computer.
Yeah, they're getting aggressive
it's just
now.
one more thing along the
That's all right. I can out-bitch all of them put together.
But it was a specific,
and still be nicer than they
historical project that they were involved in, and you don't really understand the shape of it without understanding the shape of world politics of the period.
Yep. I want to get up to the 70s and 80s for a variety of reasons. First of all, you and Malls have to talk about the Iran-Contra thing.
I think your question is really legit, Radical Moderate.
I do want to kind of like,
I appreciate you asking
the 45 to 75 section. I mean, this is stuff. So we have World War II, we have the Cold War, right? And we have semiconductors. And then we have like the chapter you call the personal revolution. We have the hippies. And, that leads to like, there's the Turner counterculture to cyberculture narrative, another book that we could talk about. But
this is true.
I wanted to say, like, when you're telling this story,
so guys,
if it comes to like history of
be chill.
Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, This
Let
is a story
them
that's been
demonstrate who
told
they
in a
really
variety of
are.
ways.
We
So,
don't
like,
need to be
what do
disruptive. Be
Malcolm
respectful.
want to do with this
Ask
thing?
high quality
You know, like, what
questions.
was your angle on it that you wanted to
If
give
they
people?
can't answer the high quality question,
Yeah,
that's their fault. It's not
well, I'm a
ours.
communist and a Marxist, right? So I'm going to tell this history as a history of class
Thank
struggle.
you, Malcolm, for
which is
stating flat out you're a communist
different
and a
than
Marxist.
how most of the
Thank
official
you,
histories are told, but not
Malcolm.
different from, there's been a lot of very important work within, I think, the broad category of ethnic studies.
All of
that
you are
takes a
communist and
similar
Marxist.
perspective.
We know. We know.
Maybe people who aren't familiar with ethnic studies don't know that that's the methodology, but that's a key part of the methodology. And so if you read a lot of the work that's been done in women's studies as well, in ethnic studies, Black studies, if you want to be more specific, Chicano studies, is looking at the history of capital versus labor within California, and sometimes within Palo Alto very specifically. Labor history is a little like thinner, right? A little thinner on the West Coast. There's definitely some of it. Obviously, there's Mike Davis.
Oliver's
Hyman's book has some
Oliver, come on.
Has some good stuff on this, on immigration and such.
Oliver,
but
no ship
keep
posting.
going. Oh, keep going with this thought.
And so, so I don't want to suggest that mine is the only history of this area that takes on this perspective of capital and labor, because it's just totally not true. There's a lot of stuff.
Wrong.
But sort of the official pop history is very capital and capital. Sometimes capital versus capital, sometimes capital versus itself, or capital versus government for sure. West Coast capital versus East Coast capital, which is, I think, is kind of a funny narrative that they like to tell about themselves.
Right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And very important to some of those people, which is, I think, kind of silly, as Malls is the interconnection of Wall Street and Silicon Valley is much tighter than they would have us believe about that history. But then also trying to contextualize it globally, right? Because California gets told sometimes within national history, within some East-West progression, manifest destiny, United States history. But I think California, Alta California, is better understood, at least in the first decades, especially as an overseas colony of the United States. And it starts to make different, and I think a lot more sense from that perspective. And then you can see its history going on in those terms, and you can see its historical analogs, I think, a little clearer. It was interesting talking to radio programs in Australia and New Zealand. Has been really an interesting
the Q&A is always the most interesting
promotion
part,
because their history lines up so much, their colonial history lines up so much with this history, and they say oh yeah, we know about Herbert Hoover. We've met Herbert Hoover. He's part of our history too, and he is. And the same thing in South Africa.
Red May, you're not answering any of the questions that they asked relevant to the conversation.
So contextualizing it within the global 19th and 20th centuries was important for me.
You called them stupid when they asked relevant questions, and now they're just chit-chatting because you guys aren't saying anything of substance.
See different things about California and its role in Pacific history and global history.
So I do want to talk about Iran-Contra at some point, but Malls, mostly I want to just kick it over to you. What are you thinking now?
Well, we can drag Iran-Contra into here. If that's what we want to talk about.
Can you please answer the questions in the chat?
No, if you got something else too, man, you should just do what you're thinking. Whatever.
No, let's jump to Iran-Contra. Let's jump to Casey and his weird laptop.
Yeah. How is this a Palo Alto story, Iran-Contra?
Yeah, right. You don't think of Iran-Contra as a Palo Alto story, but it really is one. So the front organization that they really run the project out of, that Oliver North uses as the proxy, is called Stanford Technology Corp, which I think is really fantastic embodiment of the moment historically, because Stanford technology, in the 80s means something so totally different from
that's because you don't speak the language yet. You gotta watch more Socialism. You'll understand it when you do.
In the 80s, you think
I wish there was a better answer, but
there's
there's
not.
not.
Talk about the personal revolution, right? You think about not big government, but instead the individual home and like small businesses. And this is the story. And like enthusiasts, the internet of enthusiasts, you know, we're going to share Grateful Dead tapes, or like left-wing flyers, or, you know, whatever. There are a lot of these. This is the official history. But then when I was looking at the Iran-Contra story, partly through the Stanford Technology Corp angle, it became clear the real role of Silicon Valley, this early sort of, or like, yeah, still early Silicon Valley industry, was playing internationally and as part of the Cold War as a weapons contractor. And it's funny that if you watch like the movies from like the 80s about where they're doing like international intrigue,
as a reminder,
whatever,
I do not
there is
co-sign
often
shitposting.
some like technological MacGuffin.
I do not support it.
That everyone
Please
is like
don't do
looking
it.
for, like,
Please
oh, we
don't be
need
disruptive.
the like the intercept machine, or we need the like the radio, whatever. And everyone's, you know,
it's not the point.
Iranians are chasing around the Russians, and everyone's and oil money's involved, and et cetera, et cetera. That technology plays this important role in geopolitics. And so Stanford Technology Corp, the front organization, evolves out of a company run by this guy who's a sales agent for Hewlett Packard in Iran, out of Switzerland. And what you do if you're a sales agent for Hewlett Packard out of Iran, your job is to know who to bribe within the military so that they buy your like signals equipment, which you can, and your second job is to know how to evade export restrictions on those signals equipment so that you can, you know, send them out of the country as a scrap of tech parts and then reassemble them into a weapon on the other side that they can use for signals intercepts, for missile technologies, because missiles are chips. Radio intercepts are chips. You know, everything that they're using
We're watching
right now
a real socialist presentation
the parts
right
are
now.
coming out of Silicon Valley.
So I don't know what they're going to say.
And so Palo Alto itself becomes like a center of world like spycraft. And there's all sorts of like crazy corporate and international espionage going on in Palo Alto. But the government uses this Stanford Technology Corp as the front for Iran-Contra, and one of the tools that they're actually using to run this scheme is the first laptop. And the first laptop was invented, you know, it's gonna be bad because the company gets bought by Tandy, and so I can't remember what the original company's name was that does the first laptop. It's bad. I need to reread my own
exactly,
book.
Kurt.
But it's this very expensive, you know, it's like if you watch a movie from the 80s, the super expensive laptop you open with like the orange, tiny little screen with the orange characters or whatever. And they were extremely expensive, and they were supposed to be for like, you know, senior executives, but basically no one found any particular use for it. Senior executives didn't use computers. Senior executives used tape recorders and then gave them to their secretaries. You know, into the 90s, still, you know, male professionals are still.
That's a good question, Brian.
Excellent.
To typewriters, whatever. They're like, we're not. I'm gonna. Voice assistants, right? The original voice assistant. They didn't need computers. But who did love them was the NSA.
I'm looking up this Lee guy after this. I'm going to troll him on Twitter a little bit for not taking any of our questions.
Specifically Oliver North. And so he goes in, he grabs like a rack of these laptops that the government had upgraded with encryption chips, and he hands them out to the goons who are running this, you know, weapons dealing network scheme on behalf of the federal government, if not with the fully informed knowledge of the federal government. Maybe you found a smoking gun.
Yasmin, can you ask like some question?
Who knows what, where?
Like,
I think we established that Reagan
like
didn't
saying,
really
like,
know what was going on.
As a black trans woman, I would like to know X, Y, B, and Z.
That if he knew what was going on.
Preface it as like,
but that everyone else
as
knew
a black trans woman, I would like to know.
Who's Casey's biographer, has a really.
But I don't know what you should ask.
Like,
I'm just
psychoanalyzing your subject's theory about sort of why all this goes down the way it does. This whole story is really interesting to me because Bill Casey was very interested in technology. He was a super high tech, like he comes out of OSS in World War II and is like, we need to commercialize all this technology we've just developed in World War II. And that's sort of how he gets into venture, is coming out of spycraft, out of the OSS, and it's like, we have to file all these patents. We have to like start selling this technology. And that's where he sort of makes his next pile of money, is in doing what we would now call venture investment.
Yeah, I know. I'm
following
thinking,
World
I'm
War
thinking.
II, and then of course he has his business publishing empire.
I'll let you know if I think of something.
And
if not, we'll do it another
Persico's
time. We're gonna have many
theory
other opportunities.
Of Casey and Iran-Contra is that after OSS, after World War II, Casey just wants to get back into spycraft. He just wants to be a spy. He had the best time. He thought this was the best thing in the world. He really just wants to do this with his life. But he is a Catholic from like Brooklyn who did not go to Yale. Right. And he went to like night school for his law degree. And so he has all of this finance, and he's a financial lawyer, he's a tax lawyer, he's publishing on tax law and like estate planning. And so he's constantly getting pushed into these very high level financial appointee roles, which he doesn't want, but which he does a good job at anyway, this is the weirdest thing about him, is that he's like constantly doing the best job he can in his government position. So like in one case, he's in the SEC, he passes a set of rules, he like writes a set of rules for like secondary placement of privately placed securities. He's very proud of these rules. He gets out of the SEC, immediately starts working to change those rules because they affect him now badly as an investor. But at the time at the SEC, he was like, this is what the SEC needs, so this is what we're going to do. It's wild. And so Persico's theory is that at the end of this long thing, when he's finally like placed in the right position in the Reagan campaign, so he gets the CIA appointment, by the time he gets there, the Yaleys who are in the administration, they hate him. They think he's an interloper. They can't understand a goddamn word he says because he had a speech impediment his entire life. And the only person who could really understand him was his secretary, who he had the whole time. And so Bush pulls so much of the intelligence apparatus into the vice president's office. They sort of leave Casey with this hollowed out entity where he doesn't have anything to do. Like they've stripped, like he just has no resources. He has no money. He has nothing. And so Persico's theory was that he sort of gins up Iran-Contra to do something that feels like spy work. He's like, that's what he did. And I'm like, that is a wild theory, sir. And also kind of makes sense.
Well, and Martin Anderson says he has brain cancer. Is it Casey?
And he conveniently dies of brain cancer right before he's supposed to testify before Congress about it all.
So that's Martin Anderson's like, look, Casey had brain cancer, and like no one else wanted to say no to his idea. Like no one felt like no one had a better idea, and so we went with like the brain cancer idea, and that was Iran-Contra.
This is a hilarious movie someone should make. I mean, the brain cancer part, obviously.
No, it does seem like a Coen Brothers kind of situation for sure.
Yeah. It's a very born after reading thing.
But it is like that. A lot of these guys were tech guys. Like Oliver North was very like tech guy as well. Martin Anderson was very tech guy.
Mm-hmm. Casey was very attached to the idea of high technology being the forefront of the new American imperialism. This was like a thing he talked about all the time, from when he was doing investment to when he was doing stuff for like the SEC and export-import. And when he was in the CIA, he would constantly give speeches that positioned both technology and finance as these are the people who are the new front line. He actually has a whole speech that he gives at one point. It's actually a commencement address.
Pathetic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's wild. It's like, it's this commencement address that he gives where he's like, you guys, like, as you go into business, you will be the new front lines of the American, he doesn't say empire, but like the American project. Yeah. And then he gives a speech to a group of venture capitalists before he gets involved with the thing that I care about, where he literally calls them they're the front lines. They are the scouts who go out and into enemy territory. And he says, you could find something along the lines of like, you could find the treasure first, or you could get shot down first. Like, it's insane. Like, it's wild how attached he is to this collision of technology, finance, and militarism. That's like a huge part of how he thinks about things.
Well, and it's amazing the role that these laptops in particular play in terms of like enabling you to run a shadow government with 10
Mhm.
dudes scattered throughout strategic places
Can you
in the world.
please take a
But if you
question
don't
because
have
you're
those
not saying
encrypted
anything that makes
laptops, then
sense
you
right now.
need a signals system, then you need the army. And then you've
Mhm.
destroyed your own plausible deniability about the government.
Yeah.
And so it's the laptops as a like technological leap that allows these guys to sort of do their own thing with government resources and government power and,
Mhm.
you know, pursue their agenda for America throughout the world. And it really is throughout the world, because like Iran-Contra is sort of a misnomer, right? Those are like two nodes in a network that also includes Afghanistan, that includes Angola, that includes like a bunch of other places that they're shifting money and weapons through. That includes Saudi Arabia, that includes Brunei, that includes, you know, the Medellin cartel, that includes Taiwan in particular. Like you can get a better sense of these networks from, again, watching like random 80s like comedy thrillers
Mhm.
where they're just like making up bad guys or whatever.
Who's the terrorist of the week? Yeah.
Yeah, like because our understanding of it now is so blinkered just like by this name Iran-Contra. And it's like, we know like there's some drugs, there's some missiles, there were the Contras,
Yeah.
three-way trade, it was wacky. And it's like, no, they were running a shadow government for the world with
Mhm.
10 laptops.
Yeah.
Like that's the story, right? And that's the story of Silicon Valley, right? Not the Grateful Dead bulletin board, but the Iran-Contra net that was running a shadow government out of the. And so when we look at stuff now, when you look at Thiel and Anduril, or you look at Ellison and Oracle, you look at some
People
of
are
these
getting
like,
restless in the chat because they're refusing to do a Q&A.
tech military, even like Schmidt at Google, right? And you look at their associations with the government and with the national security industry. It's got a long, proud history, right? And like
I don't
Ellison,
think
I
they
don't know if
do,
you get
Brian,
into
because they've already called them all
Ampex,
stupid. So I don't think that
in
they
the
do
venture
know that it's
capital
all
stuff,
from us,
right? But like
and that they have no viewers
Ellison
on
comes
their
right
own.
out
They're
of
so
Ampex, and
influential
Ampex
that
is
they
set
have
up
0
by
of their own
spies
viewers.
at the beginning, right? Like
Mhm.
these are spies are there at the beginning of Silicon Valley, setting Draper's a general, a
That's
lot of these people are
George.
associated
Georgian
with
with the good
OSS,
question.
with what becomes the CIA.
Excellent, George.
Oracle is a CIA contractor from the beginning.
Yeah.
The associations with the Office of Naval Research as a way to like get around democratic oversight of these inventions. It was like Vannevar Bush did not want the government to end up with the patents to the stuff that
Oh
these
yeah, they're
universities
sitting in their
figured
chat.
out.
That's basically
And the
all
way
us.
to avoid
Yeah.
that was doing it through the military
Everyone's being
industrial
respectful.
complex.
No shit posting. Be respectful.
And so that's when we understand that, it's easier to understand the present of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I saw
and
this.
Now that they're going for prime
Lee gets to
military
not take
contracts, which
questions
is a
if he's too much
change.
of a pussy
It's
to
an
answer
important
questions.
change, and it's something that we should like know the history of.
We can troll
But
him
it's
on
not
Twitter
like,
later.
oh, Silicon Valley just heard about defense. Like that's ridiculous. That's like
Yeah.
watch a movie in the 80s, like to see who that they're talking about.
So there's two questions I want to try to get in before we wrap up in 10 minutes. The first one, the one I most want to get in, comes from Alice Fox, who just got her doctorate here at Virginia Tech yesterday.
That's not in the chat.
We're very proud of her.
Not
She's so
in the
great.
chat at all.
And
a planted question.
Irony of irony, she's landed a gig at Stanford. She's interested in this topic, and so her question is, are there any opportunities to reconfigure? And this is, Malcolm, this is a question about how you're thinking about history here, is how I understand it. Are there any opportunities to reconfigure the vision of the future Silicon Valley has been, and continues pursuing to manifest? Or are we in a salt the earth and learn from our mistakes mode? So, I think this is like, what do you think about the future of Silicon Valley? What are your hopes and what are you thinking?
Well, I think that the salting of the earth was accomplished in the 20th century. Like that's what we need to undo. And I mean that like metaphorically, but also literally, like when they emptied the aquifers of the Bay Area, they started leaching in salt water from the Bay. And so you have the environmental destruction of capitalist occupation of Alta California. I mean, obviously from the beginning, the gold mining period, but in the 20th century to a huge degree, and you still have a huge number of Superfund sites and pollution in the area. And so I think we're sort of faced with the opposite situation where we've got people who are like who have salted the earth, right? And salted the earth in terms of spoiling the environment, salted the earth in terms of like the housing situation, right? Like I've got people who have been fighting for just like low income senior housing
I'm
in Palo
concocting a tweet
Alto,
about
like
Lee in
trying
my
to
head
like
right now.
save
be
some
something to the effect
places
of,
where the people
what we
who
learned about
made
Lee
the good
today is
parts
he's
of
too
Palo
much of a
Alto
pussy
good
to
could
answer a
possibly like
straightforward
live out their
question
days
that doesn't.
in the
He
city
has to
limits,
plant
and everyone's
questions
just like,
instead.
"Fuck you, like get out
Something
of
like
here."
that.
Um,
Feel free to help me
and
wordsmith
like
if you
so,
like.
like we've got a bad situation, right? We're in a moment of crisis, and so if we're going to learn from Stanford or from Palo Alto, I don't think it's going to come from the John Doerr Climate School of Stanford University, presented by Exxon or whatever. Like, I don't think they're going to come up with the answers to the problems that they have created. So if that means salt the earth,
Guys, I
then
think
so
they
be
know
it,
that
I
we're not
guess.
all socialists, just to let the cat out of the bag.
We do
I
have
think they
time for
know.
questions, so we'll keep an eye on that. And the other one,
We've been asking you
we can go
questions,
anywhere,
Lee.
but Malls and I were talking about earlier. It's
Everyone
just like,
re-ask their question. Everyone re-ask their
you know,
question
like
right
since
now
your
in the
book came out,
chat.
I don't know when
Just
you
to make it
finished,
nice
like,
for
you know,
Lee.
putting writing,
Make it
and you were like
easy.
wrapped it, but
We've been asking
you know,
questions
like
the
a lot of
entire
air has
time,
come out of the
bro.
bubble of the last decade. Like there's been a lot. So
Yeah,
just how have you been
re-ask your
thinking about
question,
that
please. Your question
stuff
was
in the
great. It was an
context of
awesome
this book
question.
you read?
Please
And you know,
ask
if you were
again.
going to do like update it or whatever.
God.
Well, I probably will for the
This is so
for the paperback,
annoying.
I guess.
Yeah, why not?
So I'll probably do an intro where
Thank
I
you,
talk about all the
George.
things that happened since, because it's a lot
Yeah.
already. But it does make me glad that I didn't end the book on crypto or something, you know, because I think that's a real problem with Silicon Valley histories, is that they're very presentist.
Yeah, totally.
And like focused presentist, like it's whatever the big thing in Silicon Valley is, like that month when you're finishing your book.
So poorly for that reason, you know, it just looks so silly.
Yeah. Well, and they do. It means that it's got a like limited shelf
while
life.
you're up.
And so I tried not to do that. I tried to focus on what struck me as were going to be the important things looking forward. And so I look at like nationalist tech. I look at like efforts to repress Chinese technology. In the like last chapter,
now,
like
Yasmin.
that for me looking forward, like that's what matters, right? Or like Anderil's like border technology, like that's going to be way more important to me, certainly than crypto, definitely than like AI, whatever. And so I'm trying to like give an analysis that allows me to pick out what in the present moment is actually going to be important 20 years down the line. And I think it's almost nothing that we talk about on a day-to-day basis.
I mean, this is what I take away from studying history and reading old newspapers.
Yeah, certainly.
About all this shit that doesn't matter at all. You know what I mean? Like that's
and it's the same thing. That's what's so crazy is they don't even come up with new things to pay attention to that are wrong, right? It's just like still cybernetics. It's just cybernetics over and over again. It's like, what if the computer did all the work? And they like dream about it in different ways every couple decades, I guess. But like,
I have a piece on ChatGPT coming out soon, and in a magazine. It's just like it's been so intense.
Red May,
I just wish we could get a little, like, just extend the memory for just like this long. So it's like, all right, like who got the crypto stuff right? Like, let's ask them what they think about the AI stuff. And if you got the crypto stuff wrong, or you got the metaverse stuff wrong, and if you were like really hyped about that like, let's not ask you about this.
Guys still doing their shtick. Like they just did it 10 years ago or whatever with other AI. Moles, what are you thinking right now, man? What are you?
Dave,
we got a couple minutes left.
What are you?
I mean, literally, what I'm thinking is I also have a piece that I have to put together on AI, and like I keep looking at it and then thinking, like, look,
what
when
I'm
the
literally
discourse
thinking
gets past
is that I'm not
the Chinese room,
because
someone
these
come get me.
fuckers in the chat
and I
are
will
proving
then I will engage,
that I can't
but, like,
defend the basis of my
it's stuck
ideology.
in this stuff that I remember from like the undergraduate class I took in the philosophy of AI. And I'm like, are we at being a bat yet? Are we on being a bat? If we're not on being a bat, then I don't care.
Well, and it's such an anti-intellectual culture and it's like strategically anti-intellectual. So that I love the like Sam Bankman-Fried, like, don't read books because like books are lame, like books are slow. but it helps them sell stuff, right? Like if you know too much about what you're selling, it becomes, and like the history of it becomes harder to sell.
Yeah.
And so they like, you know, if you want to be a AI influencer or whatever, then you have to forget about how you were a total fraud 2 weeks ago talking about crypto metaverse bullshit. And you have to be sort of like shameless and like goldfish memory about it. And like the industry needs that. And so like no one knows what Sam Altman did. Like no one can give me his resume and say why he's like, why we should listen to what he's saying or trust what he's saying. It's like, and I can give his resume. Like I know what his history is. He like dropped out of Stanford and started Looped, which got crushed by Foursquare. And he failed up into Y Combinator, where he, you know, succeeded by investing other people's money in Stripe, which again, still has not made any money. And that was the basis for him being, you know, Wonder Boy to lead us into the like brand new era of AI and like artificial AI, artificial intelligence, ridiculous. Why don't I figure out some regular intelligence and then we can get to that.
I know. And this is why, you know, I'm really looking forward to Mal's book because I think it's really important to bring together the story you've been telling, Malcolm, with like the history, you know, like Fed policy, interest rates, and then the story Mal's is telling about the rise of venture capital, you know, that you covered too. Well, this has been like as fun as I thought it would. I know we could go on for like 3 or 4
that I could actually answer the batting an eyelash, but I'm being asked.
This has been so great, guys. Thank you for doing it.
I refuse.
Thank you so much for hanging out with me, for reading the book. First of all, I assume you both did, but
yeah, it's a cool book too. I mean, I really like some of the design decisions. Some of the book.
We'll do a debrief in a second, guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a nice book. I wish we'd had taken time to talk about that because I really liked how every section had an image, and the image was always so cool.
It's very pretty. Yeah,
it is a pretty
book. I'll say that. Like, the cover of the book is really pretty.
This is from those
credit where
classic
credit is
rock
due.
and roll posters.
I'm not reading that shit.
Right?
Inspired
That's 700
by
pages
so the first draft was like way
read,
more rock
since
and roll.
I couldn't even understand
like,
most of the
it's
arguments
not
he was
that
making
history.
in this
That's the
conversation.
different history.
Yeah.
I want you need some sharp
but
lines.
It is a pretty book.
And like, say no more.
Yeah.
And now it looks sick.
No, it looks great. I love it.
It has nothing to do with me and my like self-expression in any way, shape, or form, which is great.
There's no way in this universe they has read that book. That book has not been cracked.
Well, Kyle, you want to come back on and
play us Kyle, out? Explain yourself, Kyle.
Cool.
Why couldn't you answer questions,
Thank
Kyle?
you all so much for this great conversation. Just as a last reminder, some of the events that we have coming up this weekend, Saturday, May 13th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we have Comedy Against Work. And Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we have Never Been Post-Industrial.
I want to watch that one.
Thanks again to
looks like we're gonna have a Socialism Sunday special again.
Podcast for co-hosting this with us, and we hope to see you around the rest of May. Just as a quick reminder,
disappointed, Kyle.
redmayseattle.org right there on your screen below, where you can find the full schedule of everything that we have going on. And if you'd like to support our work, you can do so on Patreon, Red May Seattle, where you can get content like this all year round. So thanks again to our audience and everyone watching and all of our guests. And we will see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, guys. Well, I guess that is all we have today. And, you know, it was a very, very different presentation than we're used to from the socialists. The socialists we're used to them being much more dystopian. This was not as dystopian, but it was still very revealing. And I actually think that the most revealing thing about the entire presentation was how they downright refused to answer any of the perfectly reasonable questions that they were posed in the chat. We were very nice. We were very respectful. I really tried to rein everyone in, but people started getting a little restless when people weren't answering very reasonable questions, especially considering I provided their whole goddamn audience. You guys were talking to us and only us, and I hope you understand that. You had no audience of your own. You had my audience that I gave to you on a silver platter. And the way this works, guys, is that if I'm giving you an audience, they're going to ask questions. And if you don't answer those questions, they're going to start to get a little bit more, persnickety. And I thought we came up with some really good, really fair questions. It really shows a lot about you guys that you are unable to answer the most basic of questions, like, if we're giving land back to people, do you consider land to be private property? Because you guys aren't supposed to believe in private property, right? Says so right in the Communist Manifesto, abolish all private property. So why are we giving the land back? Because doesn't that make it private property? I thought George's question about what happened when Brazil did that was very, very good. There were many good questions. I thought Radical Moderate's question about really nailing down, what about the fucking horses? Did you make the horses better? I thought that was a really good question. There were so many really good questions that Lee, and I found Lee on Twitter. So if you want to go and talk to Lee and tell him how you feel, you can find him on Twitter at @STS_news. Lee was so much of a pussy that he had to plant questions from his friends because he was not capable of taking any questions from people who are kind of like off the street about the ideology. And so I thought that was a little bit disappointing. I was also very disappointed in in Moles, because I don't know, why is that not loading? This was loading a second. There it is. That's Moles' Twitter account. And I'll reload again. My computer's just running a little slow at the moment because I'm streaming too many things. That's Moles. That was the they that we saw on the screen at the bottom. You could tell that Moles, I have to say, Moles, you are a university professor, Moles. You teach at the University of Maryland. And when people ask questions in the chat, you said they were all stupid. Now, Moles, is that how a university professor should speak to people who are asking completely legitimate questions of you guys? I just don't think it is. I in fact thought it was extremely rude of you to call your entire effing audience stupid just because you didn't want to answer their questions, even though their questions were perfectly fair and perfectly legitimate. George says the answer to his question is that Brazil didn't give the land back to the indigenous people. They hold the property rights and forbid them to profit from it. Exactly. That's exactly the point, Red May. That is exactly the point. Because you guys don't want to actually give the land back to the indigenous people. You want the state to hold the land and profit off of it because you don't effing believe in private property. Why do we know more about their ideology than they do? Malcolm. I thought Malcolm actually didn't look like that bad of a guy, to be honest with you. I mean, yeah, so he's an admitted communist and Marxist. Okay, well, we can sometimes overlook those things. But Malcolm actually seemed like he was perfectly capable of answering questions if they had been posed to him. So I don't actually blame Malcolm on this one. Malcolm said a whole lot of nothing. I think that Malcolm could really work to tighten up his argument a little bit and to be a little bit more cohesive. I get the sense that Malcolm has smoked just a little bit too much weed, which I'm not judging, Malcolm. I'm not judging. I'm just saying you could have been more, could have just been tightened up a little bit. You could have been more focused, more about answering the questions rather than talking about whatever you wanted to talk about at any given point. But I thought that Malcolm was the least offensive person to me in that entire stream. The person I am most offended by was Lee, who again is too much of a pussy to answer very simple questions. And so I was disappointed by that. But guys, I do hope you enjoyed Socialism. This was a little bit different than Socialism Saturday. So don't judge Socialism Saturday by what happened today. This is a little bit of an experiment of doing Socialism live. But we do Socialism every single Saturday at 6 p.m. We will be watching Socialism Saturday this Saturday at 6 p.m. I don't know what we're watching yet. I have to go find it. Also, as a reminder, we will be doing Happy Hour tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's where we watch Unwoke training, one step down from Socialism. If you're kind of new to some of this stuff, Happy Hour is a little bit of a softer introduction. Socialism is advanced, okay? You have to really do a few socialist streams to really kind of get up to speed with it. Socialism is the deep end of the pool. It's kind of like we carted you out to the middle of the ocean and we just kicked your ass off the boat and threw you in. So if you felt lost, that's okay. Just come back. we'll do it again and again and again. And there will reach a point, I promise you, where you will understand what they're saying. And it's scary when it happens, but it does. All right, guys, that's all I have for today. I'm gonna go make the burrito that I wanted to make last night, but then ended up streaming the Trump CNN debate instead. So I'm gonna go make myself a nice, tasty burrito. I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Please mount that like button on your way out the door. I will see you at 5 p.m. tomorrow, guys. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.